What's up, everyone? Welcome to another episode of Keystone Academy. This is the 8th and final episode in our series on Adobe Premiere Basics, and today's video is on understanding basic color correction. So we're going to show you how to use the Lumetri Color feature in Adobe Premiere, and also how to read your Lumetri Scopes to fine-tune your color correction. So in Adobe Premiere, when you are in your color workspace, which is what I'm in right now, you automatically have access to some color correcting features that include Lumetri Color and Lumetri Scopes. So Lumetri Color is basically where you can do all of your fine-tuning and color correction. There are a lot of other different effects that can be used to manipulate color, but Lumetri is the easiest to use and probably the most comprehensive of all of the different color correcting options. So within Lumetri Color, you have a bunch of different categories here. You have basic correction, which is what we'll be going over today. You have creative, curves, color wheels and match, HSL secondary, and vignette. And these are all just different options for different stages of the color correcting process, but a lot of it is really just preference. It's what do you prefer to use to color correct your footage. But before we go ahead and make any actual corrections over here, let's look at our Lumetri Scopes so I can kind of explain to you how this works. So within Lumetri Scopes right now, I have selected, when I click on this little wrench here, you can see that I have selected the Parade and Waveform. The Parade is what's right here on the right, which is currently RGB. So that's red, green, blue. It's showing me the levels of my red, green, and blue throughout this image at the frame that we're frozen on right now. And then my waveform, which is this over here, is Luma, which is light. So in order to change these, if you ever wanted to, you would go down to Parade or Waveform Type and select whichever one you prefer. But personally, these two are the easiest to use because one of them is simply breaking down the exposure of your image, while the other is focusing on the color. So I know looking at this can be a little daunting because it is at first really hard to understand what this kind of means and signifies, but we can kind of break it down by starting with the Luma. So basically from left to right here on the horizontal axis, it is actually representing the image from the left to the right side. So what you see over here is representing the light in what you see over here on the image. The vertical axis, however, does not actually refer to the spatial layout of the image. Instead, the vertical axis is actually the level of light. So if you look at the left side of this waveform, what you see over here is the level of light at different points on this side of the image. And, so on forth. The center is the levels of light around here where Dylan is sitting, and the right side corresponds to the right side. And then your RGB Parade is actually working pretty much in the exact same way. The only reason it looks different is because it's scrunched together so that you can see all three colors here. But if you're looking at the red values, you're seeing it from left to right in the image here, and then the level of light is the exact same. So the way that color correcting kind of works, and some of the things that you have to understand, is that the light is broken down really into four main separate categories. You have your whites, which are anything that is bright white in your image, like this light, anything that is basically a true white. Then you have your highlights, which would be something like usually skin tones or anything that's brighter in your image. Then you have shadows, which are more of your darker accent colors, like say this picture frame here. And then you have your blacks, which are what is true black in the image. So the pieces of this frame, the little eyeball of the cat, and maybe some of the details over here with the brushes. So now that we've gone over these terms, we can now actually get into color correcting. And it's important to note that what we're doing here is color correcting and not color grading, because color grading is more of actually stylizing your image, when color correction is just correcting the image and making it look normal to the human eye. So what we can do is, once we have a clip selected, which we already do, we can go up to our Lumetri Color window, and we are just going to focus on basic correction. So I just clicked on that and it dropped down the entire basic correction little window over here. So what I usually do, and what I think makes most sense to do, is to start with tone before you go into white balance. So basically adjusting the actual light values of the clip before you actually mess with any of your color. So exposure is something that I really try not to mess with that much. You can use this in certain scenarios when you don't properly expose the image on your camera, but if you are exposing it correctly, then this should be something that you really never have to touch. And contrast, I also don't really find myself messing with very much, and that's not because that it's something that can be prevented in camera, but more so because you can really adjust the contrast through the use of these other settings down here. So like I mentioned before, an image has highlights, shadows, whites, and blacks, which we talked about over in our Lumetri Scopes. So as you can see here, this is where we can actually adjust these individually. So let's go ahead and start color correcting this clip. As you can see down in the timeline, my playhead is on the first frame of this video clip, and that's okay because since this is an interview and Dylan isn't really moving, the composition of the shot isn't really changing, this will be a pretty representative image of the clip. So that is something to keep in mind. However, if you are using a shot that has a lot of motion to it, that you want to make sure you are color correcting for basically an average of that clip. But for this, super simple, we can just pick this frame and kind of use this as a reference point. So like I said, we're going to do a lot of this based on our Lumetri Scopes here. So I usually start with my blacks and my whites. So down here you can see that this is the lowest part on this image, which means that these are the blacks. And if you can compare this to the image over here, you can see that this represents these parts of the easel. There are also some parts that are black or pretty close to black over here, and those are probably a lot of details over here in the brushes. But what we want to do is we want to get these values down to 0. In other words, you want to make what is supposed to be black truly black. So I'll go over here to my Lumetri Color window, and we are just going to slowly slide this into the negatives until those black parts basically just barely touch that 0 line. You don't want to overdo it, but you want to get it so it's just kind of touching and just starting to flatten out. So that looks pretty good over here on my scopes, and I like the way that the blacks look in this image. They look black, but they are not too black, and you can still see the definition and detail. So from there, we'll go to whites, and with whites, you basically want to do the same thing, but you want to do it with 100 instead of 0. And if you notice here, there are already some little splotches up here at 100 in our Lumetri Scopes, and that corresponds to the light fixtures here and some of the reflections in the image. So let's not really take that into account when we're talking about bringing up these top values up to 100. So let's go over here to our Lumetri Color, and we're just going to click and drag this to the right. And obviously you can see the image just kind of brightening up as a whole, and we'll bring it to about right here. We want the white areas at the top here to be pretty close to 100, but we don't want anything to be washed out in the image. And what I mean by washed out is you don't want everything that's white just to look the same color white where you lose detail in the image itself. Now, if I want to see the changes I've made so far, at the top of my Lumetri Color tab, there's this little FX button, and if I click this, it will go back to its original state as if this effect was not applied. I can click it again, and it'll go back. That way I can actually see the changes that I've made so far. So now I'm going to move on to my highlights and my shadows. So on the Lumetri Scopes, your highlights should usually sit around 70, and your shadows should usually be around 30. And like I said before, the highlights are usually just the brighter parts of the image that aren't fully white, like your skin tones, and 30 is usually your dark accents. So I will come back over here, and kind of adjust my highlights. I'll just pull them up and down and kind of see what I think looks best. I think I'll pull these up a little bit to kind of brighten up Dylan's face, but not too much, so maybe about right here. And then I will go to my shadows, and I'll probably pull these down a little bit to create a little more contrast and bring in a little more detail. I like it about right here. It makes his hair darker and makes kind of the features in the back darker and makes all the detail kind of stand out and pop a little bit. And now we will move on to the actual color, or the white balance. And I will start with the blues and oranges. And one way to really kind of tell what you're looking at, in addition to your scopes over here, is just by looking at the whites in the image. So do I think this looks a little more orange or blue? And then kind of go from there. So I'll grab this. I think it's honestly a little bit on the orange side. So I'll pull it this way and kind of aim to make that more of a pure white. And then I'll do the same thing with my green and magenta slider. And I'm probably going to pull this a little to the right. And what that'll do is it'll make his face a little more red and make it look a little livelier. So color correction is always a necessary step in the editing process, even if you don't think it is. A lot of times you'll look at a clip that you shot or that was given to you and you'll think, oh, that looks pretty good. But if you look at the side by side of what we started with here and what we ended with, you can tell that the color correction made a pretty big difference. So if you ever think that a clip doesn't need to be color corrected or a video doesn't need to be color corrected, just go ahead and color correct one clip and see what kind of difference it can make. Thank you guys for watching this episode, and I hope you've tuned into the other episodes in this Adobe Premiere Basics series. We will be pumping out some more content here shortly, so if you'd like, drop a comment and let us know what you'd like to see us do videos on next. Thank you guys for watching Keystone Academy's Premiere Pro Basics.